James had been hiking for hours through Blackwater Forest when he first heard the whistling. It was faint at first, so soft he thought it might be the wind rustling through the pine needles above. But as the afternoon wore on, the melody became clearer. A simple tune, for notes repeated over and over. He stopped and looked around. The trail stretched ahead, winding between towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. No one was visible in either direction. "Hello?" he called out. His voice seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing the sound. The whistling stopped immediately. James shrugged and continued walking. He had another 3 miles to go before reaching the camping site where his friends were waiting. They'd planned this reunion for months. 5 college buddies spending a weekend in the wilderness, just like they used to do before careers and families pulled them in different directions. After a few minutes, the whistling started again. Closer this time. Same 4 notes, but slower. Almost deliberate. James quickened his pace. The trail was getting steeper, winding up the mountainside. His backpack felt heavier with each step. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool air. The whistling followed. When he rounded a bend in the trail, James froze. 20 feet ahead stood a figure. It was hard to make out details in the dappled forest light, but something seemed wrong about its proportions. Arms too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey there," James called out, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm heading to Pinecrest Campground. Are you going that way?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. But the whistling, that same 4-note pattern, was definitely coming from it. James considered his options. The trail was too narrow to go around, and the underbrush on either side was too thick to push through easily. Going back meant adding hours to his journey, possibly getting caught in the woods after dark. "Excuse me," he called again, louder this time. "Could you let me pass?" The figure slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest, away from the trail. The whistling stopped. In the silence that followed, James heard other sounds from the direction the figure was pointing. Faint laughter, the clinking of bottles, familiar voices. "Scott, Mike, is that you guys?" James called out, relief washing over him. His friends must have come looking for him when he was late. The figure lowered its arm and stepped off the trail, disappearing between 2 large trees. James hurried forward, peering into the forest where the figure had pointed. Through the trees he could make out what looked like a clearing. The sounds were definitely coming from there, his friends' voices, their distinctive laughs. Without hesitation, James left the trail, pushing through the underbrush toward the sounds. The forest grew denser. Branches scratched his face and arms, but he could still hear his friends ahead, sounding like they were having a great time without him. After struggling through the thick vegetation for several minutes, James stumbled into a small clearing. There was no campsite, no friends, just a perfect circle of mushrooms in the center, surrounded by 7 tree stumps arranged like seats. The voices and laughter suddenly stopped. James turned to go back to the trail, but the woods behind him looked unfamiliar. That's impenetrable. Which way had he come from? The whistling started again. From all directions now. The same 4 notes coming from the trees around him. As James spun around, trying to locate the source, he noticed figures stepping out from behind the trees. 7 of them. All with the same wrong proportions. All whistling the same tune. They began to move toward him, slowly closing the circle. James's phone had no signal, it never did in these woods. His friends wouldn't miss him until nightfall. And no one ever ventured off this particular trail. The locals knew better. The 7 figures drew closer, their whistling growing louder. James backed up until he felt something solid behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with the original figure from the trail. This close he could finally see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, bark-like skin with a small, round hole where the mouth should be. The whistling was coming from that hole. The figure reached for him with impossibly long fingers as the others closed in from behind. James screamed, but the sound died in the dense forest air, absorbed just like his voice had been earlier. 3 days later, a search party found James's backpack on the trail. Of James himself there was no sign. The only clue was a crude flute carved from dark wood, left in the middle of the path. When a park ranger picked it up and put it to his lips out of curiosity, all he could produce was the same 4 notes, over and over. The search was called off after a week. James's friends told authorities that they'd never planned a camping trip. They hadn't spoken to James in months. His car was found at the trailhead, a map inside with Blackwater Forest circled and a note in James's handwriting, "Find the whistling man." To this day, hikers in Blackwater Forest sometimes report hearing a distant whistling, 4 notes, repeated. Rangers warn visitors to stay on the marked trails and, most importantly, never follow the sound. Because whatever whistles in those woods isn't human. And it's always looking for someone new to join its circle. Dr. Sarah Chen had studied trees her entire career, but she'd never seen anything like the specimens in Oak Hollow Forest. From the outside, they looked like ordinary oaks, massive ancient trunks with sprawling canopies. But her core samples revealed something extraordinary. Many of the trees were completely hollow inside, despite showing no external signs of disease or decay. "It doesn't make sense," she told her research assistant, Marcus. "These trees should have collapsed years ago. The outer layers are only a few inches thick in some cases." Marcus shrugged as he cataloged their samples. "Maybe it's some kind of adaptation? The soil here is unusual, high mineral content, especially iron." They'd set up their research station in an abandoned ranger cabin on the edge of the forest. For 6 weeks, they'd been taking samples, setting up monitoring equipment, and documenting the strange hollow oaks. The locals in the nearby town of Millfield had been less than welcoming when they learned the purpose of Sarah's research. "Those trees are special," the elderly owner of the general store had told her. "Been here longer than the town. Longer than any of us. Best to leave them be." Sarah had dismissed it as rural superstition. But as their research progressed, strange things began happening. Equipment would fail mysteriously. Sample cores would disappear overnight from their locked cabin. And always, there was the feeling of being watched whenever they ventured deep into the forest. One night, after a day of collecting data, Sarah woke to a strange sound, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to be coming from the forest. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Marcus, and went to the cabin window. The forest was alive with pulsing blue light. Curiosity overcoming caution, Sarah pulled on her boots and jacket and slipped outside. The humming grew louder as she approached the tree line, vibrating through her chest. The light pulsed in rhythm with the sound, emanating from deeper in the forest. She followed the glow, moving between the massive oak trunks. The further she went, the more intense the light and sound became, until she emerged into a clearing she hadn't encountered before. In the center stood the largest oak she'd ever seen, ancient and gnarled, its trunk at least 15 feet in diameter. But unlike the other trees, this one had a visible opening at its base, a perfectly arched doorway into its hollow interior. Blue light spilled from the opening, pulsing with the mysterious humming. Sarah approached slowly, her scientific curiosity battling with a growing sense of dread. The opening was large enough for her to enter without stooping. Inside, the hollow trunk was much larger than seemed possible from outside, a cavernous space with walls of smooth, polished wood. The blue light emanated from thousands of tiny points embedded in the inner surface, like stars. And she wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows, human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. They circled the inner walls of the tree, trailing long fingers along the glowing points. Sarah tried to retreat, but the opening had disappeared. "Welcome, observer," a voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "We've been waiting for someone new." The figures turned toward her, their faces finally catching the blue light. They weren't human at all. Their features were wooden, bark-like, with knots where eyes should be and jagged lines for mouths. Some looked fresher, more recently formed. Others were ancient, their wooden faces cracked and weathered. What are you?" Sarah managed to ask. "We are the Hollow Ones," the voice replied. "Once human like you. Observers, scientists, curious minds who came to study the forest." One of the wooden figures stepped forward, newer looking than the others. With a shock of recognition, Sarah saw it was wearing clothes identical to those missing from Marcus's dresser this morning. "The trees need us," the Marcus thing said, its voice creaking like branches in wind. "They've always needed caretakers. They're dormant during the day but at night." "You're not Marcus." Sarah backed away, bumping into the curved inner wall. "Not anymore," it agreed. "But I remember being him. Just as you'll remember being you for a time." The other figures began moving closer, reaching for her with wooden fingers. Sarah screamed, clawing at the wall behind her, searching for the vanished doorway. Suddenly, her fingers sank into the wood as if it were soft clay. The wall pulled at her, drawing her in. She struggled, but her limbs were growing stiff, her skin hardening and darkening. "Don't fight it," the Marcus thing said. "It doesn't hurt for long. And then you'll understand everything." The last thing Sarah saw before her eyes transformed into wooden knots was the blue light growing brighter, the humming louder, as all the hollow trees in the forest lit up at once. a network of ancient organisms far more complex and aware than she had ever imagined. 3 days later, a search party found the research cabin empty. Equipment and personal belongings were still there, but of Dr. Chen and her assistant, there was no trace. The only clue was a strange wooden figure on the cabin porch, a crude doll with features that vaguely resembled Sarah, carved from fresh oak. The locals weren't surprised. They quietly took down the research area signs and let the forest reclaim the cabin. The trees of Oak Hollow Forest continued their silent watch, their hollow interiors hiding secrets no outsider would ever fully understand. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark, hikers report seeing a blue glow deep in the forest, accompanied by a strange humming sound. Those who are smart turn back immediately. Those who investigate are never seen again. Though sometimes new wooden figures appear on the edge of town, their features vaguely familiar. "I don't think this is the right spot," Lisa said, looking at the crude map they'd been given. "The clearing should be bigger." Mike dropped his heavy backpack and stretched. "It's getting dark. We've been walking for hours. This is good enough." Their camping trip had been Tom's idea, a weekend away from technology, deep in Raven's Peak Forest. He'd gotten the map from his uncle, who claimed to know a perfect spot, a secluded clearing next to a small lake, far from the designated camping areas and other hikers. "The map says there should be water nearby," Lisa insisted. "I don't hear any." "We probably took a wrong turn a mile back," Jenny said, already unpacking her tent. "But I'm with Mike. It's too late to keep going. We can find the lake tomorrow." Tom looked uneasy. "My uncle was specific about not camping just anywhere in these woods," he said. "Your uncle also said we'd reach the spot in 2 hours," Mike interrupted. "It's been 5. The map's obviously wrong." They settled on the small clearing, setting up their 3 tents as the forest darkened around them. Without a lake for water, they were limited to what they'd carried. The campfire provided little comfort against the unusual chill that descended as night fell. "Did anyone bring extra batteries?" Jenny asked, shaking her flashlight. "Mine just died." "That's weird," Lisa said. "Mine too." One by one all their flashlights failed. Even their backup lantern flickered and went out despite fresh batteries. Only the campfire provided light now, and it seemed to be burning lower than it should, the flames oddly dull and weak. "At least we have the fire," Mike said, trying to sound unconcerned as he added more wood. "And it's a clear night. Look at those stars." They all looked up at the small patch of sky visible through the trees. The stars did seem unusually bright and numerous. But as they watched, the stars directly above their clearing began to go out, one by one, as if something was passing between them and the earth. "Probably just clouds," Tom said, but his voice trembled. They huddled closer to the fire as the darkness above their clearing became absolute, a perfect circle of blackness surrounded by stars. "Do you guys hear that?" Jenny whispered. A low, rhythmic sound had begun, too regular to be the wind, too mechanical to be an animal. A series of clicks followed by a grinding noise over and over, moving in a circle around their clearing. "It's just branches rubbing together," Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. The sounds continued, growing louder. The campfire dimmed further, barely providing enough light to see each other's faces. "We should leave," Lisa said suddenly. "Right now. Pack up and go." "And go where?" Mike demanded. "It's pitch black. We get lost immediately." "We're already lost," Tom said quietly. "This isn't where we're supposed to be." The clicking and grinding sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Lisa screamed, pointing to the edge of the clearing. A pale face was visible just beyond the reach of the firelight, unnaturally white, with features that seemed slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to create a human face from a description without ever seeing one. As they watched in horror, more faces appeared between the trees surrounding their camp. Dozens of them. All identical. All staring without blinking. "Don't move," Tom whispered. "Don't run." But Jenny panicked. She bolted toward what she thought was a gap between the watchers. The moment she crossed the edge of the clearing, the faces vanished, not retreating but simply blinking out of existence. Jenny's scream cut off abruptly. "Jenny!" Mike called, jumping up. "Don't!" Tom grabbed his arm. "That's what they want." A moment later, Jenny walked back into the clearing. But her movements were wrong, stiff and jerky like a marionette. Her face had changed, now identical to the pale faces watching from the trees. When she spoke, her voice was hollow and resonant, as if coming from deep underground. "This place is ours," Jenny's body said. "You were warned. This forest has rules. What did you do to her? Lisa sobbed. Your friend trespassed, the thing wearing Jenny's body replied. As did you all. The clearing chose you, not the other way around. Now you must choose. Choose what? Mike demanded. One stays. 3 may leave when dawn comes. But we keep one. Lisa clutched Tom's arm. We're not leaving anyone behind. Then none leave, Jenny's body said simply. The forest keeps all. The fire died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. The clicking and grinding sounds resumed, much closer now. What followed was the longest night of their lives. The 3 huddled together as things moved around them in the darkness. Sometimes they felt cold breath on their necks or fingers trailing across their backs. Sometimes they heard whispers and voices almost, but not quite, like Jenny's. By the time dawn finally began breaking through the trees, they were nearly catatonic with fear. As promised, the pale faces returned with the first light, forming a circle around the clearing. Jenny's body stood among them, her eyes now completely black. Choose, the voices said in unison. 1 stays. 3 go. They looked at each other, horrified at the choice before them. Take me, Tom finally said, stepping forward. It was my idea to come here. No. Lisa grabbed him. It's the only way, he said. My uncle tried to warn us. I should have listened more carefully. Before Lisa or Mike could stop him, Tom walked to the edge of the clearing. The pale figures parted, allowing him through. The last they saw of him was his back as he walked deeper into the forest, surrounded by the identical watchers. True to the promise, Lisa, Mike, and Jenny's body were able to leave when the sun rose fully. But Jenny never spoke again, never seemed fully present. Her movements remained stiff, her eyes vacant. Doctors found nothing physically wrong with her, but she spent the rest of her life in an institution, doing nothing but drawing the same image over and over, a circle of pale faces surrounding a small clearing in the woods. As for Tom, he was never seen again. But hikers in Ravens Peak Forest occasionally report seeing a young man standing among the trees, his face unnaturally pale, warning them away from certain parts of the woods. The clearing chooses, he tells them. Not you. Those who heed the warning survive to tell the tale. Those who don't are never heard from again. The Midnight Trail was famous among extreme hikers, a challenging route through Shadowmere woods that, according to local tradition, could only be hiked during the full moon. Park regulations prohibited night hiking, but that had never stopped the dedicated few who sought the unique thrill of traversing the ancient forest under moonlight. Ellie Chen was making a documentary about these night hikers, a subculture she'd discovered while researching unusual outdoor activities. Her 3 subjects were veterans of the Midnight Trail: Victor, who'd hiked it 7 times, Damien, who claimed the trail changed its course every full moon, and Rebecca, who documented strange phenomena during her night hikes. The forest is different at night, Rebecca explained as Ellie set up her camera at the trailhead. It's not just the darkness. It's like the rules change. Distances stretch. Sounds travel differently. And sometimes, you see things that shouldn't be there. Ellie nodded, pretending to take the mysticism seriously while privately dismissing it as the typical exaggerations of adrenaline junkies. Her documentary would focus on the psychology of extreme hiking, not supposed supernatural elements. We need to move, Victor said, checking his watch. We have exactly 7 hours until dawn. The trail takes 6 in perfect conditions. They set out, headlamps cutting through the darkness. Ellie filmed as they walked, asking questions about their experiences. The forest was dense and ancient, massive trees blocking out most of the moonlight except for occasional clearings. Despite her skepticism, Ellie had to admit there was something eerie about the woods at night, the strange acoustics that sometimes made voices sound distant even when the speaker was right beside her, the way shadows seemed to linger just beyond the reach of their lights. An hour into the hike, Damien stopped suddenly, holding up his hand. What's wrong? Ellie asked. Listen, he whispered. They all fell silent. At first, Ellie heard nothing but the normal forest sounds, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. Then she heard it, footsteps, matching their pace exactly, coming from somewhere off the trail. That's just an echo, she said, though it didn't sound like one. There are no echoes on the Midnight Trail, Rebecca said. But there are followers. Followers? Ellie turned her camera toward the sound. Keep filming if you want, Victor said grimly, but keep moving. Don't acknowledge them, don't point your light at them, and whatever you do, don't invite them to join us. Who's them? Ellie demanded, but the 3 hikers had already resumed walking, their pace noticeably faster. The footsteps continued parallel to their path. Sometimes they seemed to fall behind, only to suddenly be ahead of the group. Occasionally, Ellie thought she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, tall, thin shapes moving between trees, but whenever she turned to look directly, there was nothing there. 2 hours into the hike, they reached a clearing where the full moon shone brightly. The hikers visibly relaxed. "They don't come into moonlight," Rebecca explained, seeing Ellie's questioning look. "Who doesn't?" Ellie pressed. The 3 hikers exchanged glances. "The night hikers," Damien finally said. "They're what happens when you break the rules of the Midnight Trail." "That's just a story to scare novices," Ellie scoffed. "Every story has a source," Victor said quietly. "The Midnight Trail has 3 main rules. 1. Stay on the path. 2. Complete the trail before dawn. 3. Never hike alone." "What happens if you break the rules?" Ellie asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "You become a night hiker," Rebecca said simply. "Forever walking the trail but never completing it. Always following those who come after, hoping to find a replacement." "A replacement?" "The only way to stop being a night hiker is to convince someone else to take your place," Damien explained. "That's why we never acknowledge them, never speak to them, and never, ever invite them to join us." Ellie opened her mouth to tell them how ridiculous this sounded, but she was interrupted by a voice from the edge of the clearing, a voice that sounded almost but not quite human. "May I join you?" it asked. "I've lost my way." They all turned. A figure stood just at the tree line, where the moonlight met the darkness. It looked like a hiker, proper gear, headlamp, backpack, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements too fluid when it shifted its weight. "Don't answer," Victor hissed. "No one say a word to it." "But what if it's just another hiker who needs help?" Ellie whispered back. "It's not," Rebecca said firmly. "Look at its feet." Ellie pointed her camera toward the figure's feet. Instead of touching the ground, they hovered an inch above it. "May I join you?" the figure asked again, its voice more insistent. "I've been hiking for so long. So very long." Despite the warnings, Ellie felt a strange compulsion to answer, to invite the figure to join them. The words rose to her lips unbidden. Damien clasped his hand over her mouth. "Time to go," he said urgently. "The clearing isn't safe anymore." They hurried across the moonlit space, back into the forest on the other side. The footsteps resumed immediately, but now there were more of them coming from all sides. "They're hurting us," Victor said grimly, consulting his GPS. "We're being pushed off the trail." "Keep going straight," Rebecca insisted. "No matter what, stay on the path." But the path itself seemed to be changing, narrowing and winding in ways that didn't match their maps. Trees that should have been landmarks were missing or in the wrong places. And all around them, the footsteps grew closer. "May I join you?" Voices whispered from the darkness. "May I walk with you a while?" 4 hours into the hike, exhausted and disoriented, they reached another clearing. But instead of being bathed in moonlight, this one was strangely dark. Looking up, Ellie saw that the full moon had disappeared, covered by clouds that hadn't been there before. "This isn't right," Victor said, checking his watch. "We should be almost at the end of the trail by now." "We've been walking in circles," Damien realized, looking at the GPS. "How is that possible?" "We never turned around." "The trail changes at night," Rebecca reminded them. "I told you that." The footsteps had stopped. The forest was completely silent. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of their own breathing seemed to carry in the dead air. Then, one by one, headlamps began to appear in the forest surrounding the clearing. Dozens of them, then hundreds, forming a complete circle around the 4 hikers. Behind each light was a figure, some looking almost normal, others hideously distorted as if they'd been stretched or compressed. But all were floating slightly above the ground. "What's happening?" Ellie whispered, her camera forgotten at her side. "Dawn's approaching," Victor said, his voice resigned. "We're not going to make it off the trail in time." "But the rules," Ellie started. "Will be broken," Damien finished for her. "We'll still be on the trail when the sun rises." "Then we become like them," Rebecca said, nodding toward the surrounding figures. "Night hikers." "Unless..." Victor looked meaningfully at Ellie. "Unless what?" she asked, backing away from him. "Unless we find a replacement," Damien said. "Someone who isn't a regular hiker of the Midnight Trail. Someone new." All 3 turned to look at Ellie, their expressions suddenly as blank and inhuman as the watchers in the trees. "You planned this," Ellie realized. "You needed a 4th person. A sacrifice." "Our time was running out," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the same strange quality as the thing that had spoken to them earlier. "We've been night hikers for years. Decades in Victor's case." "You're not really filming a documentary," Victor said. "That was just a story we put in your head to get you here. You've been a night hiker for months already. You just don't remember yet." Ellie tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Looking down, she saw with horror that they were no longer touching the ground. "Welcome to the Midnight Trail," Damien said. "May we join you?" As dawn broke over Shadowmere Woods, park rangers found 3 hikers unconscious at the end of the trail: Victor, Damien, and Rebecca. They had no memory of the night's events, only a strange compulsion to warn others never to hike the Midnight Trail during a full moon. Of Ellie Chin, nothing was ever found except her camera. The footage showed only static except for the final frame, hundreds of floating lights among trees, and at the center, a new figure with Ellie's face, her feet hovering above the ground, her mouth forming the words, "May I join you?" The town of Evergreen had always depended on the forest for its livelihood. The lumber mill provided most of the jobs, the hunting was excellent, and tourists came each fall to see the spectacular colors. But there were rules about how the forest could be used, rules that had been established generations ago and passed down as a mixture of practical conservation and local superstition. Never cut a tree marked with a spiral. Never hunt more than you need. And never, ever enter the Heart Grove, a small, circular stand of ancient trees at the center of the forest. When Maxwell Porter bought the lumber company and the rights to harvest most of the forest, he dismissed these traditions as backward thinking that stood in the way of progress. The marked trees were often the largest and most valuable. The Heart Grove contained old-growth timber worth millions. And as for hunting limits, well, he wasn't interested in hunting, just clearing the land as efficiently as possible. "You don't understand," Martha Kingsley, the elderly town historian, tried to explain at a community meeting. "There's a balance that must be maintained. The forest has a keeper, and there will be consequences if the rules are broken." Maxwell laughed it off. "The only keeper of this forest is now me," he declared. "And I plan to keep it profitable." The clearing began the following week. Maxwell brought in extra crews and equipment from out of town, ignoring the refusal of local workers to participate. The marked trees were the first to go, their massive trunks providing enough timber to fill a dozen trucks. Strange things began happening almost immediately. Equipment malfunctioned in inexplicable ways. Workers reported disorienting experiences in the forest, paths that should have been straight leading them in circles, the sound of footsteps following them but always just out of sight. Several men quit after claiming to have seen a tall figure watching them from between the trees, a figure that seemed to be made partly of wood and partly of shadow. Maxwell dismissed it all as sabotage by unhappy locals or the overactive imaginations of superstitious workers. But even he couldn't explain the dreams that had begun to plague everyone involved with the clearing, vivid nightmares of being lost in an endless forest while something hunted them from all sides. Despite the problems, the operation continued. Maxwell was determined to reach the Heart Grove, convinced that whatever was causing the disturbances was hidden there. Perhaps environmental activists had set up some kind of camp or equipment that was interfering with his operation. As the clearing approached the Heart Grove, the phenomena intensified. The weather changed abruptly, unseasonable cold, thick mist that materialized out of nowhere, sudden storms that struck only where the cutting was taking place. Workers began to disappear, one or two at first, then entire crews. Some were found wandering miles away, unable to explain how they got there or what they had seen. Others were never found at all. Maxwell hired security, installed cameras throughout the cutting zone, brought in experts to explain the strange occurrences. The cameras recorded nothing unusual except in the moments before each disappearance, when they would show a brief glimpse of something moving at the edge of the frame, something tall and branching like a walking tree. Finally, only the Heart Grove remained standing, a perfect circle of 13 massive trees, each at least 500 years old. Maxwell decided to oversee the cutting himself, bringing his most loyal foreman and a new crew who hadn't heard the stories. They arrived at dawn, equipment ready. But as they approached the grove, they found Martha Kingsley standing in their path. "This is your last warning," she said. "The forest keeper has been patient, but that patience is at an end. Leave the Heart Grove standing and rebuild what you've destroyed or face the consequences." "Move her," Maxwell ordered his men. But none would approach the old woman, who stood with unnatural stillness, her eyes reflecting the early morning light in a way that made them appear to glow from within. "Fine," Maxwell snarled, grabbing a chainsaw himself. "I'll do it myself." He pushed past Martha, who made no move to stop him. The Heart Grove waited, silent and imposing. Maxwell approached the nearest tree, a massive oak with a trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't have linked arms around it. Its bark was carved with the same spiral pattern he'd seen on the other marked trees. "Watch and learn," he called to his hesitant crew. "Your forest keeper is nothing but a myth." The chainsaw roared to life. Maxwell pressed it against the ancient trunk and began to cut. The wood offered strange resistance, and a dark red sap began to flow from the cut, thick as blood and with a sickly sweet odor. A wind rose suddenly, though the trees barely moved. It carried a sound, not quite a voice, not quite a moan, that seemed to come from all directions at once. Martha spoke behind him. "It's coming." The temperature plummeted. Frost began forming on the equipment and on the ground around them. The men backed away, some already turning to run. Maxwell kept cutting, his face contorted with determination and rage. "It's here," Martha said. From the depths of the forest came a figure that Maxwell at first took to be a man of abnormal height. But as it drew closer, he realized it wasn't human at all. It walked on 2 legs and had a torso and arms of sorts, but there the resemblance ended. Its body appeared to be made of twisted branches and roots, constantly shifting and reforming. Its head was a hollow between raised limbs, with points of green light where eyes might be. And it was tall, 15 feet at least, moving with the deliberate patience of something that has existed for centuries. Maxwell's crew scattered, fleeing back toward their vehicles. Only he remained, the chainsaw still cutting into the bleeding tree. "What the hell is that thing?" he shouted at Martha. "The forest keeper," she replied calmly. "The first tree that ever grew here, given consciousness and formed by the forest itself. It protected this land long before humans arrived, and it will remain long after we're gone." The forest keeper approached steadily, each step causing the ground to tremble slightly. Plants sprouted and withered beneath its feet in accelerated life cycles. Small animals emerged from the underbrush to follow in its wake. Maxwell finally abandoned the cut and backed away, the chainsaw still running in his hands. "Stay back," he warned, brandishing the roaring machine like a weapon. The forest keeper paused. From its hollow center came a sound like wind through branches, forming words that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the mind. "You have broken the covenant." "I don't know what you're talking about," Maxwell stammered. "This is my land. I bought it legally." "The forest belongs to itself," the keeper replied. "The covenant was made with your ancestors. Take what you need, no more. Respect the marked ones. Keep the heart sacred." "That's just superstition," Maxwell argued, his voice shaking despite his defiant words. "I don't believe in talking trees or forest spirits." "Belief is not required for truth," the keeper responded. Its body shifted, branches extending and contracting. "The covenant is broken. Balance must be restored." "What do you want?" Maxwell asked, backing toward the edge of the grove. "A replacement." Martha stepped forward. "The old ways demanded blood sacrifice when the covenant was broken," she explained. "A life for each marked tree cut down. But I've negotiated a different arrangement." "You negotiate with this thing?" Maxwell stared at her in disbelief. "I am the town historian for a reason," Martha said. "My family has communicated with the keeper for generations. We are the human keepers of the covenant." The forest keeper extended one branch-like limb toward Maxwell, green lights fixed on him. "You will restore what was destroyed. You will become the new guardian." Before Maxwell could respond, the ground beneath him erupted with roots that wrapped around his legs, holding him in place. He screamed and swung the chainsaw, but the keeper knocked it from his hands with casual strength. "Don't fight," Martha advised. "It will only make the transition more painful." "Transition? What transition?" The roots continued to grow, working their way up Maxwell's body, penetrating his clothing and skin. Where they touched, his flesh began to change, hardening, darkening, becoming bark-like. "You wanted to own the forest," Martha said. "Now you'll be part of it forever. You'll help it regrow what was lost. Your consciousness will remain, but your form will change. In time, you might even come to appreciate the beauty of what you're becoming." "No." Maxwell struggled as the transformation continued. "You can't do this. I have rights." "So does the forest," the keeper responded. The last thing Maxwell saw as a human was Martha walking away, her piece said and done. The last thing he felt was his heart slowing, its rhythm changing to match the patient pulse of the forest around him. His final human thought was a desperate wish that he had listened to the warnings. Months later, the lumber company was bought by a conservation trust. The cutting stopped and reforestation efforts began. Local legends spoke of a new spirit seen in the recovering areas, smaller than the Great Keeper but growing stronger each year. It was said to particularly watch over the newly planted saplings, each one marked with a protective spiral. And sometimes in the dead of night, hikers reported hearing a sound like weeping coming from the young trees, the lament of a man who had wanted to possess the forest, only to be possessed by it instead. When Dr. Amelia Wright received the grant to study the unique ecosystem of Fern Valley Forest, she was ecstatic. The old-growth forest was relatively untouched, with some trees estimated to be over 1,000 years old. More interesting to Amelia, however, was the moss. Unusually thick carpets of it covered the forest floor, rocks, fallen logs, and crept up the trunks of living trees. The moss samples from this region have shown unusual properties, she explained to her research assistant, Kai. Chemical compounds we haven't seen elsewhere, and a cellular structure that's significantly different from other bryophytes. They established their research station in an abandoned cabin on the forest edge. The locals were friendly but reserved, warning them not to disturb the moss more than necessary. It doesn't like to be bothered, the elderly owner of the local diner told them. The moss remembers, you know. Amelia smiled politely at what she assumed was colorful local folklore. She was a scientist after all. Moss was non-sentient plant life. It didn't have preferences or memories. Their research began with careful observation and minimal sampling. Amelia was particularly interested in how the moss interacted with the forest ecosystem. It seemed to have a symbiotic relationship with the trees that went beyond normal plant interactions. Trees surrounded by the thickest moss growth were healthier than those with less moss coverage. After 2 weeks of study, Amelia decided it was time for more invasive research. They selected a small clearing to conduct controlled experiments, removing moss from some areas, transplanting it to others, testing its reaction to various stimuli. That's when the dreams began. Both Amelia and Kai started experiencing strangely similar nightmares. In the dreams, they were lying on the forest floor, unable to move, while the moss slowly grew over them, into their mouths, their noses, their eyes. They could feel it spreading inside them, filling their lungs, threading through their brains like green neural networks. It's just anxiety about the research, Amelia dismissed when Kai mentioned it. We're both feeling guilty about disrupting the ecosystem. But the dreams grew more intense, more specific. They began to include images of the forest from perspectives that seemed impossible, as if they were seeing through the trees themselves or from within the ground. And always, there was a sense of vast, alien intelligence slowly becoming aware of them. During the day, they noticed the moss in their test areas behaving strangely. Areas they had cleared were regrowing at impossible rates. Transplanted samples were spreading in perfect geometric patterns rather than the random growth typical of moss. Most disturbing, the moss seemed to be following them, appearing in new growths wherever they spent significant time, including inside their cabin. This isn't normal, Kai insisted, showing Amelia moss growing on their equipment that had been cleaned the night before. It's targeting us specifically. That's impossible, Amelia said. But her scientific certainty was beginning to crack. That afternoon, while taking samples from a particularly ancient tree, Amelia cut deeper than intended. A thick, greenish fluid oozed from the cut, not sap but something else. Something that moved with purpose, flowing toward the moss at the tree's base rather than dripping downward as gravity would dictate. Under her microscope back at the cabin, the fluid revealed something extraordinary. Microscopic structures that resembled neurons, forming networks similar to a primitive brain. The moss wasn't just plant matter, it was a conduit for something else. I think the whole forest might be a single organism, Amelia told Kai, excitement overriding her unease. The trees, the moss, they're like organs in a larger entity. The moss functions as a nervous system, connecting everything. And we've been cutting into it, Kai said grimly, performing experiments on a sentient being without its consent. That's anthropomorphizing, Amelia objected. Even if it's a unified organism, that doesn't mean it's sentient or capable of. She was interrupted by a sound from outside, a soft, slithering noise surrounding the cabin. They looked out the windows to see the moss advancing toward them from all sides, moving visibly now, flowing rather than growing. We need to leave, Kai said, already packing essential equipment. I need more samples first, Amelia insisted. This could be the biological discovery of the century. But as night fell, the moss reached the cabin, creeping under the door and through the smallest cracks in the windows. It grew with unnatural speed, covering the floor, walls, and furniture within hours. They retreated to the center of the main room, standing on the last clear patch of floor. The moss stopped advancing momentarily, forming a perfect circle around them. Then it began to change color, shifting from green to a bioluminescent blue. Patterns appeared across its surface, not random but deliberate. Symbols. Communication. "It's trying to talk to us," Amelia whispered, her scientific skepticism finally shattered. The patterns shifted, cycling through what seemed like different attempts at language. Finally, they formed shapes reminiscent of human neural patterns, and suddenly both researchers could hear a voice in their minds. "You have questions. We have been waiting." "What are you?" Amelia asked aloud. "We are the network. The connection. The memory." "The memory of what?" Kai asked. "Of everything that has lived and died in this forest for 10,000 years. Every thought. Every experience. Every death." The moss rippled, and suddenly their minds were flooded with images. Centuries of forest history compressed into seconds. Indigenous people who had revered the forest. European settlers who had feared it. Scientists like themselves who had studied it only to eventually join with it. "Why show us this?" Amelia managed to ask through the overwhelming sensory experience. "You sought knowledge. We offer completion." The moss began advancing again, reaching toward their feet. Wherever it touched bare skin, it adhered like a second layer, painless but impossible to remove. "We don't want to join with you," Kai said, backing away until he hit the wall. Marcus had been a forest ranger at Blackwood National Park for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like the drought they were experiencing now. 3 months without rain had left the forest dangerously dry, the creek beds cracked and empty, the wildlife desperate and bold. "We should close the hiking trails," he argued during the staff meeting. "One careless cigarette and the whole forest could go up. Tourism revenue is down enough already," his supervisor countered. "The forecast shows rain coming next week. We'll just increase patrols until then." Marcus was assigned the Eastern Quadrant, a remote section rarely visited by tourists. He packed enough supplies for 2 days and set out at dawn, the morning mist still clinging to the ground as he made his way along the narrow trail. By midday, the unnatural silence of the forest was beginning to unnerve him. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the leaves hung limp and still in the stagnant air. The trees themselves seemed to be holding their breath, waiting. He made camp in a small clearing as the sun began to set, the dry wood of his campfire catching almost too easily. As darkness fell, Marcus noticed something odd. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed closer than they had been when he arrived. "Just shadows playing tricks," he muttered to himself, adding another log to the fire. But when he woke in the night, the feeling was stronger. Opening his eyes, Marcus could have sworn the trees had moved inward several feet, their branches stretching toward his tent like grasping fingers. The next morning he blamed it on dreams and dehydration. He packed quickly and continued his patrol, but couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every time he turned around there was nothing, just trees standing exactly where trees should be. It was mid-afternoon when he found the first body. A hiker, or what remained of one, half buried in the dry soil at the base of a massive oak. The corpse was desiccated as if all moisture had been drained from it, with roots growing through the eye sockets and mouth. The victim's hands were outstretched in a final, desperate reach for escape. Marcus radioed for backup, but got only static in response. He checked his GPS. He was still in range of the repeater towers. The radio should be working. That's when he noticed the second body. And the third. All in similar conditions, all at the bases of the largest, oldest trees in the area. With growing horror, Marcus realized what he was seeing. People who, like him, had been alone in this part of the forest. Their bodies now feeding the desperate trees. He began walking quickly, then running back toward the ranger station. But the trails seemed wrong now, turning back on themselves, leading him deeper into the forest rather than out of it. As dusk approached, Marcus found himself in another clearing with no memory of how he'd reached it. His water was gone, his throat painfully dry. The trees around the perimeter stood unnaturally close together, forming an almost perfect circle. And they were moving, not swaying in the wind, for there was no wind, but slowly, incrementally shifting their positions, closing the circle. Marcus tried to run, but his legs cramped, his body crying out for water. He fell to his knees as the trees continued their inexorable approach. Now he could see what he'd missed before, the deep grooves in the earth behind each trunk, paths worn by decades, perhaps centuries of movement. The drought hadn't created this horror. It had merely made the trees desperate enough to move more quickly, to hunt more openly. As the last light faded, Marcus felt something brush his back, a branch or perhaps a root snaking across the ground with terrible purpose. It touched his neck, surprisingly cool and wet against his parched skin. A single drop of moisture trickled down his spine. The trees were offering water. All he had to do was stay. 3 days later, when the promised rains finally came, a search party found Marcus's empty ranger jacket and equipment scattered across a small clearing. Of Marcus himself, there was no sign, though the searchers couldn't help but notice how unusually green and vibrant one particular tree appeared amidst the drought-stricken forest. And if they'd looked more closely, they might have seen the face, Marcus's face, forming and dissolving in the patterns of the bark, screaming silently as the watching trees added his moisture, his essence, his memories to their ancient collective. The drought ended, but the disappearances continued. And in that part of Blackwood Forest, the trees stand just a little closer together than nature intended, waiting for the next solitary visitor to make camp in their midst. "You shouldn't go alone," the gas station attendant warned when Mira asked for directions to Echo Woods. "Those trails can be confusing, especially near dusk." "I'm just scouting locations," Mira explained, tapping her professional camera. "I'll be fine." What she didn't mention was that Echo Woods was perfect for the project she had in mind, a photo series on allegedly haunted forests. The local legends were particularly intriguing. Hikers reported hearing their own voices calling to them from deep among the trees, conversations with people who weren't there, the sounds of unseen companions walking alongside them. Perfect fodder for her series. She debunked the myths while capturing the eerie beauty that gave rise to them. The woods were quiet when she arrived, the late afternoon sun filtering through the canopy in dusty golden rays. Perfect lighting for photography. Mira set up her tripod near the trailhead, capturing the weathered sign that warned visitors not to mimic any voices they might hear. "Echo Woods," she read aloud as she adjusted her lens. "Named for an acoustic phenomenon, turned into a ghost story." "Ghost story," came her voice from somewhere deeper in the forest. Mira paused. She knew about echoes, of course, but this didn't sound like one. It was too clear, too precise, without the usual diminishing effect. "Hello," she called experimentally. "Hello," returned her exact voice from approximately the same distance as before. Interesting but not supernatural. Probably just unusual acoustics created by the terrain. She continued down the trail, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly striking scenes. A twisted old tree, a shaft of light illuminating a patch of unusual fungi, a small stream crossing. She was setting up another shot when she heard footsteps behind her. "Hello," Mira called again, turning. No one was there. But the footsteps continued, circling around her, matching her movements when she shifted her weight. "Is someone there?" she asked, fighting against the instinctive fear. There had to be a rational explanation. "Is someone there?" her voice replied from just behind her left shoulder. Mira spun around, heart racing. Nothing. Just trees and undergrowth, completely still in the windless evening. She packed her tripod quickly, deciding to stick to wider trails. As she walked, she began to hear other sounds, fragments of conversations, laughter, calling voices. Some sounded like her, speaking words she couldn't remember saying. Others were completely foreign. "Just the wind," she told herself firmly, though there was no wind. "Just the wind," agreed her voice from behind a nearby tree. The sun was setting faster than she'd anticipated, the forest growing dimmer by the minute. Mira turned back toward the trailhead, walking quickly. She'd return tomorrow with an audio recorder. Document the phenomenon properly. That's when she noticed the footprints. Her own footprints, leading ahead of her on the trail. But that was impossible. She was heading back the way she'd come. She should be following her own tracks, not seeing them in front of her. Confused, Mira looked back the way she'd just come. There were no footprints there at all, despite the soft earth that should have clearly shown her passage. "What the hell is going on?" she muttered. "Going on?" her voice echoed closer now. "Going on," repeated another version from the opposite direction. With growing unease, Mira realized she could no longer see the trailhead. The forest had grown darker, the trail less distinct. She pulled out her phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. The footsteps returned, no longer matching her movements but moving independently around her. Multiple sets now, approaching from different directions. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "Stay back, stay back, stay back," echoed multiple versions of her voice, some whispering, some screaming, all moving closer. Mira began to run, no longer caring about the direction, just needing to get away from the voices. The trail seemed to shift under her feet, winding back on itself despite her attempts to maintain a straight line. Night had fallen completely when she stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of odd, pale stones, each about waist high. They resembled crude human figures, featureless except for what might have been mouths, dark, open cavities in the stone. As Mira caught her breath, she realized the voices had stopped. But in their place was a new sound, a low, rhythmic humming emanating from the stone figures. Her photographer's instinct took over. Despite her fear, she raised her camera and snapped a picture of the stone circle. The flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, long enough for Mira to see that they weren't stones at all, but people. Petrified people, frozen mid-stride, their faces contorted in expressions of terror, their mouths open in eternal screams. In the returning darkness, the humming stopped. Then one by one the figures began to speak, each with a different voice. Voices of lost hikers, confused tourists, curious photographers who had come before. "Help me," said one in a child's voice. "Is anyone there?" asked another in an old man's trembling tones. "What the hell is going on?" said a third in Myra's own voice. With a shock of recognition, Mira raised her camera again, this time looking through the viewfinder without using the flash. In the dim starlight now filtering into the clearing, she could make out the features of one of the figures. It was her own face, her own body in mid-stride, already half turned to stone. She looked down at her hands and saw they were gray and stiffening, her fingers fusing together into solid rock. The transformation was already beginning. "No," she screamed. "This isn't possible." "Not possible," her voice echoed from the stone figure that wore her face. "Not possible," repeated the woods around her. As the petrifaction spread up her arms, Mira understood at last. Echo woods didn't just echo sounds. It echoed people, duplicated them. And when the copy was complete, the original was no longer needed, becoming just another voice in the endless chorus of the forest. The last thing Mira felt before her body hardened completely was her mouth freezing open in a silent scream. A new echo chamber for the woods to use, a new voice to lure the next curious visitor who ventured alone among the trees. "The rules are simple," Park Ranger Collins told the gathered campers. "If the mist rolls in, return to your cabins immediately. Do not wander in the mist, do not attempt to drive in it, and above all, do not respond if you hear someone calling your name." Ben Hayes exchanged skeptical glances with his girlfriend, Maya. They'd come to Lakeview Campground for a weekend of hiking and relaxation, not to be scared by local legends. "Is that really necessary?" Ben asked. "It's just fog." Ranger Collins fixed him with a level stare. 16 people have gone missing in Lakeview mist over the past decade. We haven't found any of them. So yes, Mr. Hayes, it's necessary. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, spectacular views of the lake and surrounding pine forest. Ben and Maya hiked to Eagle Point Overlook, taking photos and planning their route for the following day. "Think we'll see the famous mist?" Maya asked as they headed back to their cabin. "Hope not," Ben replied. "I want to actually enjoy the outdoors, not be locked in the cabin because of superstition." That night, they were awakened by the emergency siren, 3 long blasts that echoed across the campground. Ben pulled back the curtain to see a thick white mist rolling across the lake, enveloping the trees and cabins in an impenetrable shroud. "Guess we're staying in," Maya said, already pulling out the board games they'd brought for rainy days. But as they played, Ben grew increasingly distracted by the mist pressing against their windows, unnaturally thick and somehow animated, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "It's beautiful in a creepy way," he commented, moving to the window for a better look. As he watched, a figure emerged from the mist, a hiker, judging by the backpack and walking stick, moving slowly between the cabins. "Someone's out there," Ben said. "They shouldn't be out in this." Before Maya could respond, he opened the door and called out, "Hey, you should get inside." The figure stopped and slowly turned. The mist was too thick to make out features, but it seemed to be looking directly at Ben. Then it raised one arm and beckoned. "I think they need help," Ben said, already reaching for his jacket. "Don't," Maya grabbed his arm. "Remember what the ranger said. That's just a story to keep tourists from getting lost in bad weather," Ben replied, pulling on his boots. "I'll be right back." Despite Maya's protests, Ben stepped outside, keeping the cabin in sight as he approached the figure. But the mist seemed to thicken around him with each step, until he could barely see a few feet ahead. "Hello," he called. "Do you need help?" The figure had disappeared, but from somewhere to his left came a response, a voice that sounded eerily like Maya's. "Ben? I'm over here." Confused, Ben turned toward the voice. "Maya? I thought you were in the cabin. I came to find you, the voice replied. Follow my voice. Something felt wrong. Ben turned back toward where he thought the cabin should be, but could see nothing but white in all directions. Maya? He called again, uncertainty creeping into his voice. I'm here, Ben, came the response from yet another direction. Come quickly, something's wrong. Ben stood paralyzed with indecision. The voice sounded exactly like Maya, but Maya had been in the cabin. And now there seemed to be multiple voices calling him from different directions, all with Maya's voice, all with increasing urgency. Ben, help me. Ben, I'm lost. Ben, they're coming. He began backing away from the voices, trying to retrace his steps to the cabin. His foot struck something solid, a body lying on the ground, half hidden by mist. Ben knelt down, reaching out to help, when the body suddenly gripped his wrist with impossible strength. It was a hiker, just as he'd seen earlier, but the face was wrong, blurred and shifting as if made partly of mist itself. The eyes were the worst part, entirely white without iris or pupil. Ben? It asked with Maya's voice, its featureless face stretching into a grotesque approximation of a smile. I found you. Ben tore himself free and ran blindly through the mist, the voices pursuing him from all sides now. He collided with walls, trees, picnic tables, completely disoriented in the white void. Finally, he glimpsed a light ahead, a cabin window. With relief washing over him, Ben staggered toward it. The door opened and a figure stood silhouetted against the warm light inside. Ben? Is that you? Maya's voice called out. Ben stopped. Another Maya voice called from behind him, and another from his right. Ben, don't listen to her. I'm the real Maya. Ben, come inside quickly. Please. Ben, they'll take you like the others. Surrounded by identical voices, Ben froze, unable to determine which, if any, was truly Maya. From deeper in the mist came new voices, other lost hikers calling to loved ones who weren't there, pleading for help, screaming warnings that went unheeded. The mist walkers, those who had been lured out in previous fogs, now part of whatever lived within the white void. Ben made his choice and ran toward the cabin light. As he crossed the threshold, the figure embraced him. I was so worried, Maya said, her voice breaking. You were gone for hours. Hours? Ben pulled back to look at her. It was just a few minutes. Maya shook her head, showing him her watch. 5 hours had passed since he'd stepped outside. The rangers are searching for you, but they can't see anything in this mist. What happened out there? Before Ben could answer, there was a knock at the door. Ben? Maya? It's Ranger Collins. Is everyone all right in there? Ben moved to open the door, but Maya caught his arm, her expression suddenly fierce. Don't, she whispered. It's just the ranger, Ben said, confused by her reaction. Is it? Maya asked, pointing to the window. Through the glass, Ben could see multiple shadows moving in the mist, human-shaped but wrong somehow, elongated and fluid. And from outside came the ranger's voice again, along with others. Ben? Open the door. Ben, we need to check if you're okay. Ben, let us in. The real Maya, if this was indeed the real Maya, squeezed his hand tightly. They can imitate anyone, she whispered. That's how they get in. Throughout the night, they huddled together as things with familiar voices but unfamiliar shapes circled their cabin, calling their names, pleading to be let in. Occasionally, the mist would thin enough for them to glimpse the entities, partly human, partly fog, their features constantly shifting between recognizable faces and blank white expanses. When morning came, the mist retreated back to the lake, leaving no trace of the nocturnal visitors. Ranger Collins, the real one, surrounded by a search party, found Ben and Maya packing their car. Leaving so soon? He asked. The weather's supposed to be perfect today. We've seen enough, Ben replied, unable to meet the ranger's eyes. But I have a question. Those 16 missing people, did they all go out into the mist alone? The ranger's expression darkened. No. Some were taken from their cabins. Witnesses said they opened their doors in the night, claiming to hear family members or friends calling for help. And the witnesses? Maya asked. What happened to them? Many left like you're doing, Collins said. Others stayed, became rangers like me. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Someone has to warn the new visitors about the mist. As they drove away, Ben glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the ranger standing motionless, watching them leave. For just a moment, as they rounded a bend, Ben could have sworn the ranger's face blurred and shifted, becoming as white and featureless as the entities in the mist. Do you think we're really leaving? Maya asked quietly, staring straight ahead. Ben gripped the steering wheel tighter, the same question haunting him. Had they escaped? Or had the mist walkers already taken them during those missing hours, replacing them with copies that only thought they were human? He had no answer. But as they passed the final campground sign, they both heard what sounded like their own voices calling from the trees, begging them to come back, to return to the mist where they truly belonged. David Chin adjusted his camera on the tripod, framing the perfect shot of the ancient redwood. A professional nature photographer for 20 years, he developed a reputation for capturing images of the world's oldest trees. This particular forest contained specimens estimated to be over 2,000 years old, perfect for his new book, Silent Witnesses, Portraits of Earth's Ancient Guardians. "Should I move the reflector?" asked his assistant, Nora, gesturing to the portable light diffuser they used to soften shadows. "A little to the left," David instructed. "I want to catch that texture in the bark." They've been working in Elderwood Forest for 3 days now, photographing the oldest trees. According to the Forest Service records, the most ancient specimen, nicknamed the Patriarch, was hidden deep in the least accessible part of the preserve. Few people ever made the difficult hike to see it. "We'll head for the Patriarch tomorrow," David announced as they packed up for the evening. "It should be the centerpiece of the collection." At their campsite that night, an unexpected visitor arrived. An elderly man who introduced himself only as Joseph. He claimed to be a local historian and offered information about the Patriarch. The native people believed that tree was sacred, Joseph explained, declining their offer of food but accepting a cup of tea. They said it was the first tree from which all others grew. They left offerings there, tokens of gratitude for the forest's bounty. "That's fascinating," David said, already envisioning how he'd frame this narrative in his book. "Are there any specific myths associated with it?" Joseph's expression grew somber. They believed the tree contained a spirit that protected the forest. They also believed it could collect things it found interesting. "Collect things?" Nora asked. "Memories, experiences." Joseph sipped his tea. "Souls, some said." David chuckled. "Well, that's certainly dramatic. Perfect for the book." They also had strict rules about photographing it, Joseph continued as if he hadn't heard. Or rather, not photographing it. "Every culture has its superstitions," David said dismissively. "But with all due respect to traditional beliefs, I've photographed sacred trees around the world without incident." Joseph studied him for a long moment. "The forest doesn't care about your experience, Mr. Chin. It has its own rules." He stood to leave. "If you insist on going, at least don't look at it through your lens. The Patriarch doesn't like having its image captured." After the old man departed, Nora seemed uneasy. "Maybe we should respect the local traditions?" "We're not disturbing anything," David assured her. "We're celebrating these trees, documenting their majesty. There's nothing disrespectful about that." The hike to the Patriarch the next day was as challenging as promised. The trail grew increasingly faint until it disappeared entirely, forcing them to navigate by GPS coordinates provided by the Forest Service. The forest around them seemed to change subtly as they progressed, the undergrowth becoming denser, the light dimmer despite the clear sky above, the normal forest sounds gradually fading until they hiked in eerie silence. "Something feels off," Nora commented, swatting at insects that seemed unusually persistent. "Like we're being watched." David had felt it too, an oppressive awareness that pressed against his consciousness. But his desire to photograph the Patriarch overrode his discomfort. When they finally reached their destination, even David was awed into silence. The Patriarch was unlike any tree he'd ever seen, a redwood of impossible size, its trunk wider than his car, its height disappearing into the canopy above. But what made it truly extraordinary was its appearance. Unlike the relatively straight trunks of most redwoods, the Patriarch was twisted, its bark forming patterns that almost resembled faces when viewed from certain angles. "It's perfect," David breathed, already setting up his equipment. "We'll start with wide shots, then move in for details." Nora hesitated. "Remember what Joseph said." "Superstition," David replied, looking through his viewfinder. "This tree has survived 2 millennia. I doubt my camera is going to harm it now." The moment he focused on the Patriarch through his lens, David felt a strange sensation, as if the camera was pulling him forward, drawing him toward the tree. He adjusted the focus and the feeling intensified. Through the viewfinder, he could now clearly see face-like formations in the bark, much more distinct than they had appeared to his naked eye. "David?" Nora's voice seemed distant. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he muttered, unable to pull away from the viewfinder. "I just need to get this shot." Through his lens, David could now see that the faces in the bark were moving, eyes opening, mouths silently working. And behind them, deeper in the wood, were more faces. Human faces. He tried to lower the camera, but his hands wouldn't obey. Instead, he kept adjusting, focusing, capturing image after image as the tree seemed to reveal itself to him. For each click of the shutter, another secret was exposed. Centuries of absorbed lives visible in the whorls and patterns of the ancient wood. David, stop. Nora's voice came as if through water. Something's wrong with you. He felt her hand on his shoulder, trying to pull him away, but it was too late. Through the camera, David was seeing what the tree wanted him to see. Everyone who had ever photographed it, drawn it, or attempted to capture its likeness. All of them now part of its bark, their expressions frozen in various stages of realization and horror. With tremendous effort, David finally wrenched himself away from the viewfinder. He turned to Nora, his vision blurred and distorted. "Run," he managed to say. "Get away from here." But Nora wasn't looking at him. She was staring past him at the patriarch, her face pale with terror. David turned back to see what had frightened her. The tree had changed. Its bark was rippling, the face-like patterns now unmistakably human and reaching toward them, not physically moving but somehow extending their presence outward, creating a gravitational pull that David could feel tugging at his mind. "It wants to add us to its collection," he realized aloud. "Everyone who's ever tried to capture its image." Nora was backing away, but David couldn't move. His camera, still on the tripod, was now pointing itself at him, the lens adjusting on its own. He heard the shutter click repeatedly, each sound sending waves of numbness through his body. He looked down to see his hands hardening, the skin taking on the texture of bark. "Nora, go!" he shouted with his remaining strength. "Tell them not to come here." The transformation was spreading up his arms now, his flesh becoming wood, his blood turning to sap. David felt his awareness expanding even as his physical form changed, connecting to the vast network of roots beneath the forest floor, sensing the history stored within the ancient tree that was absorbing him. Centuries of knowledge, of secret witnesses to the forest's history, now becoming accessible to his transforming consciousness. His last human sight was of Nora fleeing through the trees, the forest seeming to part to let her escape, as if the patriarch was deliberately releasing her to spread the warning. One witness permitted to leave, to tell the tale of what happened to those who tried to capture the tree's true nature. Then David Chin was gone, his body fully merged with the ancient wood, his consciousness joining the collective awareness that was the patriarch. His camera remained, the final images showing his transformation, a series of shots capturing a man becoming part of the very subject he had sought to document. 3 days later, forest rangers found the camera at the base of the massive tree. The memory card contained hundreds of images, most showing only bark patterns and natural forest scenes. But the last few photos showed what appeared to be faces in the wood, some recent, others ancient, all with expressions of profound realization. Nora refused to return to the forest to identify the equipment. She left her job as a photography assistant and moved to the city, where there were no ancient trees watching from the shadows. But sometimes, when she looked at nature photographs or tree-lined streets, she could swear she saw David's face looking back at her from the patterns in the bark. One more soul collected by the patriarch, one more warning ignored. The rangers established a larger restricted zone around the patriarch after David's disappearance. The official reason given was environmental protection. But local guides now tell visitors that the true reason is simpler. The oldest tree in Elderwood Forest doesn't like having its picture taken. It prefers to take yours instead.